Walking out your faith or looking to the faith process. We're going to be looking at faith, and we're going to be looking at what it is, how it operates, how do we obtain it, how do we maintain it. We're going to be looking at how it's defined, and we're going to examine some examples of faith in the Bible so we can understand how to complete the process of faith. A very familiar passage, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. This is the faith chapter. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So this is very interesting because a substance is something that's tangible. It's matter. You can hear it, you can taste it, you can touch it. You know, water is a substance, gas is a substance, you can smell it. It's interesting because we have a substance of something that is only hoped for, and we have evidence, which we know is proof, of something that is not seen. These appear to be contrary one to the other. How can you have a substance of something that's only hoped for? How can you have proof of something that's not seen? Let's keep going. Faith is an abstract noun that cannot be perceived with our five senses. An abstract noun is something like happiness, gladness, anger, jealousy. These are nouns, but they're not things that you can operate with your five senses. So you can't smell jealousy, you can't taste anger. You might say that metaphorically, but you can't actually do these things. That brings us to a little bit of a conundrum here, because we understand that faith is one of these abstract nouns, and it can't be perceived with the five senses. But above, we said that faith was a substance. So, and we learned that a substance can be perceived. So the question now becomes, how do we reconcile these two? Now, the answer is really quite simple. Faith is something that is completely a spiritual matter. Just like we have physical senses, we have spiritual senses. You can see faith in the spirit. You can smell faith in the spirit, but it's not something that operates physically. It's not something that's carnal. The moment that it becomes carnal, it disqualifies it as faith, because that eliminates the reconciliation between these two. That's how we always know that it's faith-based, when it's spiritual and not fleshly or carnal. Now, our obtaining of faith requires us to put it into practice, which is to have faith. What I'm saying here is faith is always something that you have. It's always something that you possess. So even though it's a noun, it pretty much always operates as a verb, because you're always having faith. And when you have that faith, you always have to have faith in something or on something, or you have to have faith about a situation. So for example, I have faith that the New England Patriots will win the Super Bowl. I have faith in my mentor. I have faith that I will pass my exam. Even if you don't put the object in the sentence, there's always a contextual applied faith. So if I were to just simply use the sentence, I have faith, that would make no sense unless you knew what I was talking about. So there's always an object or an implied object when we're dealing with faith. So I just want us to really understand what this word means and the definition of it. Now, an example of faith, Peter walking on the water, very popular scripture. But Peter does something very interesting in this passage. Jesus, in verse 27, it says here, "But immediately Jesus spoke unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid." So Jesus revealed who he was. They know his voice. But Peter responded to him and said, "Lord, if it be thou, tell me to come unto thee on the water." Now the question becomes, why did Peter ask Jesus to ask him to tell him to come on the water? Did he not know that it was Jesus after Jesus spoke and he recognized his voice? How would he have known it was Jesus? If it was not Jesus, how would he have known to come on the water or not? One reason, if not the only reason, that Peter asked him to come on the water is because Peter understood that he needed a word to stand on. Peter stood not on the water, but he stood on the word come. Because why? We said before, faith always has to have something to stand on, an object. It always has to have a directive. There has to be something for you to have faith about. And it's the word of God that Peter was able to stand on to operate in faith. But what happened when Peter saw the wind boisterous, he became afraid. He began to operate by sight and not by faith. You can only operate two ways, by sight or by faith. And a parallel to those are by the flesh or by the spirit. Because fear and doubt are the enemies of faith. And the result of Peter's sight was that Jesus said he had little faith. Now this is interesting because he made it close enough to Jesus to where Jesus caught him. But regardless of how far he got, Jesus still said he had little faith because he did not complete the process. So faith is a process. You either have one of three options. You have no faith, where you don't step out on the boat at all. You have little faith, where you don't have enough to complete it, or you just have faith where you complete the process. Now I want us to look at the father of faith, Abraham. He is our prototype for the faith process. Everyone's faith process is going to be different because we're all different people. We react differently, we respond differently. But Abraham, being the father of faith, is someone we can learn from. Now, the first thing that occurred was that Abraham was migrated from independence to dependence. So God had to give a situation where Abraham became dependent upon God. And how did he go about doing that? He said, "Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, into a land that I will show thee." So God is going to show him, meaning that God is going to be the one who gets glorified. Now, this is why God brings us to dependency, because it allows for his glorification. Now, he also gives a word or a promise for someone to stand on. Abraham's promise to stand on: "And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curse thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." So this is Abraham's promise. This whole walk is based upon this initial directive that God gives, this initial promise that God gives. The next thing that occurs is that Abraham decides to step out on faith. There's always a first step. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him. So he followed instruction. And the result of him following instruction was that God rewarded him with more insight. It said, "And the Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, Unto thy seed I will give this land." So what happened was God saw Abraham's response and he decided to give him another piece of the puzzle. And this is what allows the faith to be developed into a process. God wants this to be a process. So he stepped out on faith. The next thing that occurred, and so everything was good when he stepped out on faith, but now adversity has ensued. I've heard it said a faith that can't be tested is a faith that can't be trusted. All faith will be accompanied by adversity. Adversity is simply just the testing of faith. Abraham's adversity was that there was a famine in the land. And Abraham went to Egypt, and the famine was grievous. It was a heavy famine. So he had a decision to make. I mean, at this point, he had already set up his altar. He had been praying to the Lord and everything. But a situation arose. And when the adversity comes, it presents an image, which, remember, we said an image is what? An image is sight. Adversity presents an image that appears to be contrary to the promise. So, Lord, you told me my ministry would start, but I can't get people to work with me. Lord, you told me I would have this job, but no places seem to be calling me back. Everything looks contrary, Lord, to what you have promised me. So how do I respond to this image? How do I respond to this adversity? You have two responses, two options. You can choose faith with God, or you can choose to do it yourself. Now, adversity presents the option to continue in faith or the promise to seek an alternative solution. Abraham decided to do it himself because he operated out of fear and he operated out of a carnal mind. So what he did was he told his wife, I know that you're beautiful, therefore it shall come to pass. So he created a whole scenario that was not consistent with what God told him. But he said, therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. And then he told her that she needs to say that she is his sister. Why? So that my soul shall live because of thee. So Abraham operated out of fear and out of self-preservation. He did not believe that God was reliable enough. He did not feel that he could depend on God to preserve his life. And when he made this decision, he forfeited his dependency upon God. He decided not to live by faith, and he decided instead to live by the world system. I've lost my job, so now I got to start stripping. I'm not going to depend on God. I'm not going to trust God. I lost my job. I just got to support my kids. So I'm about to start stripping. I'm about to start selling drugs. Nothing appears to be going right. I'm about to start robbing banks. My life doesn't seem like it's going well. I don't get any money singing in the choir. I'm going to go mainstream. I'm going to sing pop and R&B. I'm going to become an actor because I need to get income. I can no longer depend on God. When you choose that world system, when you choose Satan's system, or when you choose simply just to do it on your own and be independent, you get temporary rewards. Yeah, you get the fame, you get the money, you get the things that you need in the instance. But there's one thing that you're not taking into the equation, and it's that God is sovereign. What happened with Abraham was that he got chastised. God's sovereignty will not allow your way to prosper. If you are a child of God, doing it your way will not allow you. God won't allow you to do it your way. Even if you're not a child of God and you're still doing things on your own, you may believe you're prospering because you're getting money and things like that, but you're really not getting any joy. And it only results in failures and curses. So what happened was, even though everything was going fine, because of God's sovereignty, he had the ability to plague Pharaoh. And he plagued him because of Sarai, who was essentially the accursed object. And so what happened was things started going wrong with Pharaoh, and they ended up sending Abraham away. So they told him to leave. So what happened was Abraham was back to square one. God said, you tried to do it on your way. I purposely ruined it. You said you wanted a spouse. You went out and got one instead of waiting on me. So I ruined your relationship. You need to depend on me. God reverted Abram back to a state of dependency. And so Abram got a do-over. He got a mulligan. A mulligan is a golf term for when you have a really bad shot and they let you do it over. Abram ended up going back where? To the beginning. God says you have to start over. How many times have we been in a situation that was a faith walk and we tried to do it our way, we fell flat on our face, and God put us back to square one? Abram went back to square one, and more importantly, what did he do? He went back to the altar. You see, because if you go back to the previous slide and read that text, Abram did not set up the altar of the Lord. In every place that Abram went during this text, he built an altar for the Lord. But when he went to Egypt, that's when he decided he no longer needed the altar. You know, I have all the gifts and everything from Pharaoh, so I'm squared away. I'm good to go. But what happened was humility and dependency force you to call upon the name of the Lord. So God will humble you when you try to go about exalting yourself. So what happens next? Abram removes distractions. Lot was with Abram, but there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle. Abram told Lot to separate. Now, God will remove any hindrances from what he has for you, or he will ask you to remove those hindrances. And the reason why Abram and Lot were not agreeable is because Abram was in fellowship with the Lord, but Lot was not directly in fellowship with the Lord like Abram. Because remember, Abram is the father of faith. God needed him isolated. God needed him consecrated, and he needed him separated and sanctified. Lot ended up going to a place that pleased his eyes. It says Lot lifted up his eyes. So remember, sight. Lot went to a place that was driven by lust because he saw that Jordan was watered everywhere. But the thing about it was that they were sinful. After Lot was separated, that's when God gave Abram more instruction. God told him to lift up his eyes. So he lifted up his eyes from God's instruction, not from his own lust. And what happened was God gave him further affirmation of his promise. And the point is, when you remove yourself from the wrong people, when you remove the wrong people out of your life, that's when God can begin to move. But Abram would not have been able to continue on his journey if his herdsmen and Lot's herdmen were constantly feuding, because that's drama and confusion, and God is not the author of confusion. Things appear to be going well, but once again, this faith walk is mountains and valleys. So Abram is now offered a shortcut. Sodom, where Lot was, got into a war. Abram got 318 men together and they went to war on behalf of Lot. Now, as a result, the king offered Abraham wealth for what? For his men. So this is how Satan is. Satan will offer you money and status and power for your talents. So you can go about it God's way, which is the hard way, but Satan comes to offer you an easy escape route. So why are you waiting on what God is telling you to do? Why don't you go ahead and go? I got a house for you, a car for you. I got women for you, men for you. I got fame. I got money. Why don't you go ahead and do it my way? Satan always provides a counterfeit temptation that will appear to give you the same results. And he does this to deter you and to get you off the path of God's faith. And more importantly, and this is what Abram was able to realize. Abram knew that would mean that the king would be able to brag about giving Abram everything he wanted, which means that it would rob God of his glory. When we do things outside of God's order, he's no longer the person we depend on. And God demands to be glorified. And thankfully, Abram knew this. Abram gets a little nervous. So he's saying, Lord, I'm still doing this thing and I don't have any kids. So is my lineage going to be from my assistant, from my worker? You haven't done anything yet. And God realizes this. And what he did was he calmed Abram. So the carnal mind will always be at play. God offers us reaffirmation to combat the carnal mind, because these two things are at enmity with one another. And Abraham believed the Lord, and it was counted to him for righteousness. So our righteousness is based upon our belief in the Lord. And this allowed God to form a covenant. He said, in the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. So things are going all right once again. But what happens? Now a naysayer comes into play. Someone very close to Abram. Sarai said unto Abraham. She's a voice that's a different voice from God. She said, because faith comes by hearing. Faith comes by hearing. So when Sarai said to Abraham, he heard her. Now, when he heard her, he had a choice as to if he wanted to listen to her or not. And unfortunately, he did. It says that Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And when he hearkened to her, that was him choosing to listen to her and not God. And what she told Abram was, why don't you just let my maid, my assistant, do it? Because keep in mind, this is 11 years after the original promise. Abram's now 86. He was 75 when he started. He was 75 when he started this thing. So 11 years have passed. And what happened is when you do it your own way, that's not your carnal mind now, but that's someone else's carnal mind. So on your faith walk, somebody is telling you, you know what? You waiting on this thing that God's telling you about. It is not happening. It's not coming to fruition. You've been waiting on this thing for so many years. God is giving you this so-called vision, you say, but I'm not seeing any fruit. I'm not seeing any evidence. I'm not seeing any substance of what God has told you. So your best bet is to just go ahead and do it your way. That's someone else's own intellect, someone else's own bright idea that's contrary to the word of God, is contrary to faith. And once Abraham did this, he's now operating outside of faith because he listened to the voice of Sarai instead of the voice of God. And consequently, what happened was Sarai ended up becoming enemies with Hagar, even though she was the person that told Hagar to do it. But what happens is taking your own approach becomes damaging. It's damaging. So now Abraham is 99 years old. This is 24 years after the original promise. God is still reaffirming Abram about the promise. He's saying that his name shall no longer be called Abram, but now it's going to be called Abraham. And so the situation now has gotten to a point where it is laughable. It's laughable. It's impossible. It's not plausible. It's bizarre. But I want you to understand what Abraham did was that he still listened to God in spite of the odds. He still heard what God had to say. And what God was doing in this season is God was preparing Abraham. So what God was actually doing with Abraham during this process, when he renamed him and when he decided to have all of them circumcised, that was actually the purification process. God is going through a purification process where he wants Abraham to have this lineage, but he wants him to start anew, start afresh. He wants him to be cleansed. He wants his lineage to be pure. And this is why he's taking him through procedures that are preparing him to be able to walk in the promise that God has ordained for him and his lineage. So what happens next? Abraham almost botches it. So Abram is in a land and he does the exact same thing that he did the last time. He told Sarah to say that she's his sister. But what happens is sometimes God's sovereignty won't even let you mess yourself up. God ended up sending a dream to Abimelech, which basically told him to give Abram his wife back, even though he had not done anything with her. Sometimes what we do is we try to justify our lack of faith. So what Abram said was, technically she's my half sister, so it's not really a lie. We do all of these things to try to justify finding a way to operate outside of God instead of submitting to the process. But God can bless us in spite of. And finally, God delivers on his promise. So the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. God delivers on his promises. We just have to have faith. We have to understand that the stage is set for God to get his glory. And the purpose of our faith process is for a testimony to arise. When you're waiting on those bills, when you're waiting on that job, when you're waiting on that college acceptance letter, when you're waiting on that marriage, when you're having faith through all of these things, there's a purpose in your wait. And we just have to have the right mentality as we go through the process. This is the foundation for other faith walks in the future, because Abram had to do things after this. Like he had to have enough faith to take Isaac up on the mountain and potentially sacrifice him. But God provided a ram in the bush. But if Abraham had not been through this process, he probably would not have had the guts to take Isaac up on that mountain. So it's these situations that grow our faith into something deeper so we can have a better relationship with God. That's all I have for you in this video, family. I pray that you've been edified. You all take care and be blessed.